Since the 1960s, the developed world has offered help to poor countries to try to get them on the path to economic prosperity. The World Bank provides financial products and services to poor and developing countries and encourages the creation of strong economic institutions. And the UN has programs aimed at aiding poor nations, feeding the hungry, providing education, and fostering institutions which promote basic human rights. Unfortunately, for most of their history, these programs have largely been a disaster. Take sub-Saharan Africa, for example, where most of the world's poorest nations are located. From 1960 to 2000, the amount of money given in aid grew and grew, and while there was some benefit in GDP per capita, it was not nearly enough to lift anyone out of poverty. And after the mid-80s, the growth completely stalled. There was little effort to see what sort of aid helped and what was happening to the money that was sent. When researchers finally did investigate, they found that only about 15% of the money was making it to its intended destination. The rest was being siphoned by corrupt leaders, mismanagement, and incompetence. However, there is a theoretical foundation to the idea that the aid simply wasn't enough to work, and if we simply increase aid, we will see better results. We're already familiar with the Solow growth model, where depreciation and investment square off to set a steady state level of capital and GDP. In this model, we assumed that the production function should have diminishing marginal returns for capital. That is a pretty good assumption, but it might not be true at the lowest levels of capital and GDP, where some initial capital is especially productive and shows increasing returns to scale. That could create a situation called a poverty trap. With a period of increasing marginal returns for capital, the production function would have to be wavy like this. You can see that at first there are diminishing returns to capital, but then it picks up again and we see increasing returns, but eventually it levels out with diminishing returns again. There's some reason to believe this might be a better representation of the situation in poor countries. If so, it has important implications because our investment will be wavy too, meaning that there are multiple steady states. If we start at this low steady state, we will have a low GDP. But if foreign nations send a bit of aid, allowing us to increase our capital a bit, we will only enjoy a temporary increase, because beyond our steady state, depreciation is too high. But if the push is big enough to get us through those increasing marginal returns and put us on the other side of depreciation, our own economy will be able to start building on the improvements and growing even further, perhaps kickstarting the catch-up growth the Solow model would predict. Indeed, since the year 2000, aid to sub-Saharan Africa has increased significantly, and this has been met with additional increases in GDP per capita. We can only hope that soon these poor countries will foster better institutions and more stable governments, which will ignite their engines of growth. Figuring out what sort of aid actually works has been a point of focus. The economists Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo started the Poverty Action Lab, which seeks to experimentally test whether or not certain interventions are effective at promoting economic development. For their incredible and continuing insights, they were both awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2019. A lot of their work has been influential to policymakers and charities alike. For example, if our goal is to increase education, we might try paying parents to send their kids to school, buying uniforms for kids, giving them scholarships, paying for an extra teacher, paying for school meals, or providing kids with iron supplements. Esther Duflo showed that all of these increased years of education obtained by only a little per $100 spent. But providing healthcare services like deworming children in places where intestinal parasites are a problem, and simply providing information on how big the returns to education can be, were far more effective ways to spend that $100. We also have the incredible growth miracles in Asia, where countries like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, China, and even more, like Hong Kong and Singapore, have been able to industrialize and catch up with Western countries. These miracles did not all happen at once, and so we can look and see what policies were common at the points where growth finally started. First is land use reform. In each of the successful countries, farmland was taken away from landlords and given to peasant farmers. This allowed those farmers to see the returns on investments they made into improving yields and adopting better technology. In countries that haven't seen miracle growth, like the Philippines, most of the farmland is controlled by just a few powerful families. And of course, in China during the 50s and 60s, as they imposed communist policies where no one owned the farmland, it was a complete disaster. Only when they revised these policies and adopted a market economy did they see growth. Another important policy is export discipline. Against the advice of many economists, these countries often imposed steep protective tariffs to keep foreign competition out. However, they paired those policies with strict rules about exporting a certain percentage of what is produced to other countries. In South Korea and Japan, for example, they limited imports of automobiles to support their growing automobile industry. At first, this was bad news for consumers, as Japanese and South Korean car companies produced low-quality vehicles. But because they needed to export vehicles to other countries, these companies had an incentive to figure things out and learn how to make quality cars that foreigners would want to buy. Eventually, we got some new world-class automakers like Toyota and Honda in Japan, and Kia and Hyundai in Korea. Lastly, it was important for these countries to establish good financial policies which promoted long-term investments. With free market finance, the money goes to the projects with the highest short-term profit, which is usually just resource extraction. But these countries created policies which incentivized banks to keep interest rates low, incentivizing longer-term projects. To maintain these rates, the countries had to impose capital controls to prevent money from going overseas to invest in places with higher returns. Like the protective tariffs, though, eventually these policies need to be lifted. You can't stop capital outflows forever, and so Japan got rid of them in 1990, South Korea in 1993, and Taiwan in the late 80s. But China has tried to keep them, which has been a continued source of anxiety for onlookers who worry they are tempting a financial disaster. While there is still a great deal of poverty in our world, things have never looked as good as they do now. Finally, growth has started to take off everywhere, and the poorest countries have been the ones with the highest growth rates over these past 2 decades. There is 1 billion people who will be lifted out of poverty or near poverty in the coming decade or two. Ideas, art, inventions, and so many other things can be shared. They will only need people to make them. Think of how amazing and enriching life in this world will be with 1 billion more people contributing to those things. I can't wait for it.